Hi, my name is Micheal Cahill, and I'm the Vice President of Performance and Sports Science across all locations at Athlete Training and Health. What I'll be talking with you about today is the influence of growth and maturation on the development of speed in youth athletes. So just an overview of the presentation. Some of the first things we'll be doing is defining speed, then giving a basic background on pediatric exercise physiology, and then tie it all together with the adaptation to speed and practical training applications at different stages across maturation. So first up is speed.
Hey Maverick, yeah, hear about ice? What's that? You want another one? Really? I feel the need for speed.
So Top Gun is iconic, and I don't think anyone else can define speed better than Tom Cruise. But basically, everybody loves speed, and everyone's interested in it, and it's not the easiest thing to train for. So really and truly, speed is king. So speed comes in all different forms, and everybody's interested in speed. Everyone's interested in speed facts, and speed usually rules when it comes to sport and gameplay. So, for example, the fastest animal in the world, people usually think is a cheetah. It's actually a peregrine falcon, and it can fly up to 240 miles per hour. And this is just to look at it as it attacks its prey. So, most dangerous bird in the skies with regard being able to it, and rules. We look here, 40-yard dash. Everybody's interested in the 40-yard dash, most popular test event within the NFL Combine. We all can tell metrics of 4.2s, 4.3s, and we have a relative idea of what's fast and what's not fast at pro sport based upon it. As of late, we've started to delve in more detail into the kinetics and kinematics of sprinting, and Dr. Peter Wayand and Dr. Ken Clark have done a lot of work across this, and we can just see the amount of force that's applied at top speed. And the image you're seeing at the moment is actually Jeremy Warner, who's running on a force treadmill. Lastly, we're so interested in speed, we're now looking at artificial intelligence, and Boston Dynamics and MIT have done a lot of work and have been able to achieve their mechanical cheetah being able to get up to 28, 29 miles per hour on it as well. So speed is king, and speed is usually what separates a good athlete and a great athlete. That's not only speed, physical speed, but it's cognitive speed, the ability to process and make decisions. So speed in games in multiple fashions is usually what separates a high-level athlete from an elite-level athlete. So speed is complex, and the trainability of speed, though, is not easy. And that's probably why you don't know too many sub 10-second 100-meter sprinters, but you can name multiple people who've completed a marathon. So the trainability of speed is a lot more of a niche. And it's also complex in the nature that speed is not only linear, we've speed from a multi-directional standpoint as well. And that further gets broken into open chain, closed chain, pre-planned, or open movements. So there is a lot of factors. For this specific presentation, we're going to address speed in its generic nature, not get into too much of the phases or the biomechanics of speed. It's more so just how speed generically is influenced by growth and maturation in young athletes. So part 2, looking at pediatric exercise physiology. And here's something you may typically see in a bunch of 14-year-olds is the vast differentiating rates of maturation and growth across it. So we're just going to delve in and see what happens both pre, mid, and post growth spurt. And then we'll try to tie it together in part 3 with how specifically speed ties into that. So just an overview of growth and maturation. You can see here in the bottom, we have the age of the person, chronological age going all the way from 0 to 18. And then we can see the growth rate per year in inches. So one of the biggest misconceptions is that the growth spurt is the fastest period of growth. the first 2 years of life are the fastest period of growth. And we can see that here. And then as we grow, it tends to peter out, and then we get a spike somewhere in that adolescent stage is where we get a spike. The blue line is males and the pink line is females. So typically what we see is that female athletes will mature before male athletes. There is a lot of variance across when youth athletes will mature. There can be a span of about 5 years across it, but typically we see it in this 12 to 14 range in boys and about 18 months maybe previous in girls. This can happen before 10 and it can happen after 14 as well. You guys might be most familiar with the latest Michael Jordan documentary, even with Scottie Pippen's growth spurt in college. So there is variance. This is some of the average data. So what we refer to in the blue is the pre-peak height velocity. Peak height velocity is nothing more than the peak of the growth spurt, or that fastest period of growth within the growth spurt. So pre-growth spurt and pre-peak height velocity we see in the blue. And what we see here is a constant and a steady rate of growth in both males and females across. The brain has a massive influence on this. This is a point to where neuroplasticity is at its highest and the central nervous system is most excited and forming. So someone's gait pattern is usually formed by 7 or 8 years of age. It's also a critical time to learn skills and movements and to retain what those functional movement skills are. We'll touch on that a little bit more in part 3. The next one here is the peak height velocity, or the right in the middle of the growth spurt. So this is while we're ascending to our peak height velocity and then coming down off that peak height velocity, which is termed the growth spurt. And at this period, we have what's called the pruning of the brain. And it's another chance to reinforce some motor skills. But a lot happens in this period of time because of the rapid accelerated period of growth. And what's important to be aware of, especially for parents and coaches coming back after a prolonged period of time to return to play, what this series, Game Ready series, is primarily about, is being aware of, if you're dealing with athletes that are typically in this age, having taken 3 months off, 4 months off, what can happen to the body, and just to be conscious of load and to be conscious of the likelihood of injury. So likelihood of injury is higher in this period of time, and that's primarily because we get a discrepancy in the rate of growth from the limbs to the torso. Typically, we'll see the long bones of the arms and legs grow first before we start to see the torso follow. We actually will start to see a discrepancy in muscle and tendon growth in comparison to bone density. So what we see is, this is very much so under construction, and athletes are growing, meaning the body is continuously under stress at that period of time, and they're going to need to be given a chance to recover and factored in. Again, we'll look specifically how this affects training adaptation, but it's important to know that this is happening, that the likelihood for injury is highest, and that young athletes are constantly under stress, even when they're recovering due to the growth rate. This coincides with the onset of puberty, and we start to see sexual maturation and also elevated levels of testosterone in males, which will contribute to an increase in lean tissue and lean muscle mass. And then we see an increased concentration of estrogen in women and girls at adolescence, which will lead to probably an increase more so in adipose tissue or fat mass. So lastly, after this, we get post-peak height velocity. And what we see here is some of the gains in speed specifically diminish. We can have a continued or elevated increases in absolute or relative strength, traditional strength, but we don't have the same ability. The brain is not as excited, the neuroplasticity is not as high, so it doesn't have the same ability to be able to develop new skills. It's harder to teach someone brand new skills of a sport at this point, and it's even harder to reinforce the functional movement skills that hopefully we had developed. And those functional movement skills are usually the foundation and the building blocks for athletic success in team sports. So one of the things we're going to be touching on is sprint-specific methods, sprint-specific strength, and non-sprint specific strength. We start to see it being a lot more non-specific, the more pre-peak height velocity, a little bit more caution in the yellow, and then we probably need some more sprint strength-specific gains as we go to post-peak height velocity and individualize a little more as well for the athlete. So here's just a real life example of some athletes I've worked with, looking at their biological age, their chronological age, and also their training age. And what's a really important aspect in this presentation is not to categorize solely based on maturation, but to use it as a guideline and be aware of the changes that's going on in the body, but to always assess the athlete's training competence and their training history, because there's a lot of modalities that can be trained right across the spectrum. It's just know your outcomes and know the adaptation that the body may take to it. So if we look at all these athletes, we can see that they all have half a year's training. So their training age is all the same, a group of incoming freshmen at high school who all have half a year's cumulative training done, a minimum of 2 times per week. This is strength training in addition to some sport practice. We can see their age, they're all 15. So they've all turned 15 in this period of time, taken in the last semester of their freshman year. But what we can see here is a look at biological age. And all I want you guys to know with the number is the more positive the number represents how many years they are past their peak height velocity. So we can see these two here, probably tallest athletes alone, 2 years and 2.3 years. And then what's interesting is the smallest athlete as well is 2.4 years past. And we'll come back to that in a second. But a negative number is someone who has not approached that peak height velocity yet, so they're prior to it. And we can see here. And then someone who's right in the middle of it, which is half a year. So typically some of the parameters we use at Athlete Training and Health when we assess maturation to determine how we're going to train some athletes is we will look at a 1 year prior, we categorize as pre peak height velocity. And then we go with between -1 and +1 being in the middle of that growth spurt. So we get them on both sides of it. And then anyone who's more than +1, we look at it as post peak height velocity. And we can train them a little bit more specific and individualized training for them in order to get the gains we're looking for. So what's interesting with this here is we can see that just because you're tall doesn't mean you fit your post peak height velocity, because someone who has an adult height of 5 foot or 5'2", they have to go through a growth spurt at some point in time as well. It just may not be as pronounced as someone who's 6'6". So you have to be conscious as well of everyone goes through this. Some people go through it to a greater extent and it's more prominent, especially the taller you are, you may be at an increased likelihood of risk. Another thing to be aware of is ethnicity, and that specific ethnicities will hit their growth spurt a little earlier in comparison to others. So we've seen that across, and there's been some good research on it as well. We've also seen specific sports. It's not that a specific sport will allow you to hit your growth spurt earlier or later. It's probably that you've been funneled into that based across your own anthropometrics growing up. So, for example, we may see some distance runners will typically, because of a talent ID, may actually hit it a little later than some other athletes. Strength and power sports, for example, we have a bias to where a freshman football program, maybe the people selected for that sport are early maturers in order to gain success. But it's something for coaches to be conscious of, is success at a young age equates to success at a young age. It doesn't necessarily mean you have success at an elite level. And there is some good research coming out at the moment, which is actually looking at the early maturers versus late maturers and their ability or likelihood of, if they can stay in an elite junior academy, being able to be elite athletes later in life. So I think one of the things to just clarify is that youth athletes are not mini adults. And this is really important aspect to look at, just to ensure that we don't treat and train young athletes like mini adults. So with regards to training them, there is position statements have been released from the National Strength and Conditioning Association with regards to the importance of strength for young athletes. We also have International Olympic Committee consensus statement on young athletes, and there's multiple studies have been done. Specifically, John Oliver and Rodri Lloyd have done a lot of work in this area related to young athletes and how they adapt to strength, and more so the importance of strength. And it's important not to mix strength up with bulk. So here's just a look at how young is too young to start training. And strength conditioning activities initiated during pre-adolescence is shown with the blue, and that's all the way down to no strength training, no conditioning, or sport practice. So we can see sport only is in the green, and then we have a red and white line, which is strength conditioning activities initiated during adolescence. And we'll start to go into the importance of strength as it pertains to speed. And even before strength is the importance of functional movement skills as the foundations and the building blocks to build sprint-specific strength upon that. Because strength underpins biomotor control and strength underpins coordination. So what's been shown is that integrative neuromuscular training initiated in pre-adolescence and maintained into adolescence will maximize the training age and the potential to achieve optimal adulthood motor capability. So what's really important here is that we have developed some sort of strength training in with youth athletes. This can also prepare them better, specifically the connective tissues, the tendon to be able to tolerate the demands of that growth spurt, what happens. So if we can strengthen the tendon at a young age through functional movement skills, we start to see their ability to attenuate forces during the growth spurt is better, and therefore may decrease the likelihood of injury. Also, being strong moving into that growth spurt is really good to minimize the lack of coordination and what's termed adolescent awkwardness due to the disproportionate growth rates. At Athlete Training and Health, we have a pathway across, which is our student athlete, our next level athlete, our forever athlete, team athlete, and rebuild athlete. So we try and train across from 8 to 88, and hospital has always been a pillar of a community. What we try and do is reinforce the preventative health aspect of that pillar right across the whole community. Today, what we're going to focus on is more one of our performance strands, and that is the student athlete. So we're actually looking at that adolescence age of 8 to 12, 12 to 14, and 14 to 18. And some of the stuff we do and how we categorize some training, not only looking at chronological age, but also looking at their biological age and taking in the psychosocial aspect into that as well. So what we'll see is we don't take anyone pre 8 years of age, because I just truly believe that it should be as unstructured leading into that as well. Probably needs to have huge involvement from parents from a peer affiliation standpoint, and needs to be very much so based on functional movement skills and not coming into a closed setting in a weight room on turf where it could potentially be overstructured. So we'll look at these to a certain extent, and I referenced John Oliver and Rodri Lloyd, who did a long-term athlete development, which is their youth physical development model. One is for males, one is for females. I've taken the one for males right here at the moment, but we've already differentiated. Usually the main difference is that we'll just see an increase a little earlier in the growth spurt for females. We'll keep referring back to this at different phases. You can see the chronological age in years is across the top, and then we get a look at the growth rate across that, where it goes from steady growth to the spurt to rapid, and then we start getting a decline. As we move down, obviously the maturational status is listed here as well with regards pre, mid, or post. And then we can also look at some of the training adaptations. And what we'll try and do is tie this specifically into speed to see where the adaptation is highest. But one of the things to notice from these in this physical qualities is, and it's a myth that's been debunked, is that there's specific windows of opportunity to only train one specific quality at specific ages. We've seen that there's no empirical evidence to show that strength can actually be trained across the continuum. power, speed, they can all be trained. They just may be able to be trained to a different extent or to a different rate of adaptation, specifically hypertrophy. So if you try and train hypertrophy pre-adolescence, pre the onset of puberty and sexual maturation, males don't possess testosterone. So the rate of adaptation will be much higher for hypertrophy or increasing the muscle size related to it at the onset or post growth spurt. The main thing to look for this at the very bottom is the unstructured nature to the low structure, moderate and high structure. Sometimes as coaches, we have a habit to overstructure training, whereas one of the best things we can do with young athletes, especially the younger they are, is free play, exploratory play, and let them have a self-directed nature of movement. So part 3 is where we hope to tie all this in and specifically look at the adaptation of speed. So we've looked at how to assess it. We've kind of looked at the interpretation of the athlete, and now we're going to look at the prescription. So prescription of exercises, prescription of training within the guideline of what's happening from a maturational standpoint. I'll stress again the importance of taking training competency into account. Training competency is very, very important. Training age and training history, regardless of maturational level. So, but just be aware of the rate of adaptation may hinder the training adaptation. So let's look again where we went with pre-growth spurt or pre-peak height velocity. We know that the neuroplasticity is very, very high, and the ability to develop skills is at its highest at this point in time, and actually declines the later we go into adulthood. So what we see from a sprint standpoint is this is the first spurt in sprint performance. There's no gender difference in the natural development of speed, and this is primarily because it's related to the rapid development of the central nervous system. So like I said, neuroplasticity is at its highest. Our gait pattern is pretty much developed by 8 years of age. Now that doesn't mean we need to overstructure specifically related to sprinting. Usually the things that make up sprinting is going to be foundational functional movement skills, coordination, stabilization, and balance are of utmost importance. There's a rapid learning effect here, and we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket by going sports-specific skills, which would be solely focusing on sprint technique. So very important that we take a holistic approach with regard to movement, because that is the building blocks for speed to be expressed in a multi-directional nature, for speed to be expressed linearly as well. Not to say you don't reinforce proper sprint mechanics, but we try and more so push to reinforcing those sprint mechanics after 8 years of age as well. But what's really important is those foundational functional movement skills. And here's just an example of some stuff we do between that 8 to 12 with our young athletes. So some of the non-specific training, so we'll probably break it with a difference with sprint-specific training and non-sprint specific. So non-sprint specific training are ones that contribute to the development of speed across childhood. So let's look here a little bit at the youth physical development model again here as well. We can just see that we really want to focus on functional movement skills. The bigger the text in this, the more pronounced and maybe the higher the rate of adaptation and importance of that training modality at that period of time. So we can see that functional movement skills is in a bigger text than sports-specific skills, which is SSS and FMS. So that's the importance of it. Then we start to see that training should be very unstructured to low structure. So more so facilitating free play, especially from that 2 to 7 years of age. And then when we start to get from 7 to 8, we just have a low structure of training, still allowing an exploratory nature and focusing on coordination and balance. So here's some stuff we do with young athletes when they come in first, to really build that foundation to be able to express free speed during adolescence and hopefully later into life. So cartwheels, going from different surfaces across, just getting them used, stabilization in the shoulders, coordination, all multi-joint with athletes. So things you wouldn't maybe typically associate with speed straight away, but we're very, very big on a holistic approach for the young athlete. We look here, we've got climbing walls in every facility as well. And what's interesting is if you just watch the difference in the way each athlete moves their legs. So one will crisscross and the other is more so staggering it like a rock climber. But so what we're trying to do here is everything from stabilization of the shoulder to getting them to express movement in different ways because unfortunately, now that we're in the scientific age, we probably don't get out climbing trees as much. Kids aren't in parks as much anymore. You know, homework is done on iPads, games are played on iPads. So it's very important that we try and facilitate these functional movement skills and a very holistic approach to our training. And one of the most important things is the kids love it and they enjoy it. And that's most likely going to increase their likelihood of participation within a long-term athlete development pathway as well, even without them knowing they're in it. Lastly, what we can see here is we have some movement courses where we focus on movement quality, using their arms, going from soft surfaces to hard surfaces, using their legs in different ways, crisscrossing, jumping from side to side mat, walking like a tightrope, walking a rope across to increase the stabilization and the balance and the proprioceptive nature of the athlete. This will all feed into building that solid foundation in order to being able to sprint. So to tie that with the pre-adolescents, let's look at sprint-specific training. And what we see here is prepubescent athletes respond favorably to plyometric and sprint activity. Well, plyometric activity is primarily based on the rate of contraction in getting on and off the ground as quick as you can. So you could say that the greatest plyometric you can do is top end speed. So that's sprinting at top end speed. There is nothing faster the body can do than get you on and off the ground in between 0.08 or 0.1 of a second than top speed. So the bottom line with sprint specific training, when we go sprint specific, in addition to the complementary non-sprint specific training we do in developing functional movement skills, is to get fast, you have to run fast. End of story. You have to achieve high velocities in order to get fast, and you have to expose yourself to that. So the reason for that is force times mass is equal to acceleration. So the greater the amount of force you can apply relative to your body mass will determine your rate of acceleration. And young athletes, when they get, like I said, top end speed is one of the greatest plyometrics you can do. That's probably where you're going to express force at its highest. So for us, which is really important to just tie in the importance of the building blocks around sprint specific, just running fast won't do it, although it is probably the most important aspect, is achieving high velocities in sprinting right across the pathway from pre to mid to post, is that you must be able to control force before you can express it. And that comes back to developing these functional movement skills. So functional movement skills, coordination, stabilization, proprioceptive training through free play, usually between 0 to 7. And that's exploratory play. That's what kids should be doing. And that's what will most likely develop at climbing trees. So I would urge you guys to just make sure that you're facilitating that. I've always said, dealing with young athletes, that the measure of success from a parent standpoint is not how many times you bring your kid to training or you bring your kid to practice. The measure of success is actually how many times they grab you and bring you out into the garden to play, and to play in an unstructured, self-directed, free play aspect. More so at Athlete Train Health, we don't take anyone in prior to 8. It's another chance for us to encourage proper sprint technique through low structured, high velocity movements. So, and some of the exploratory movements you saw as well. So it's another chance where we can really reinforce those proper movement patterns. And there's still levels of excitability within the development of the brain at that period of time where they're most likely to retain those skills as well. We're not only tied specifically to that, is, again, you've heard me use the term exploratory play and exploratory movement, is we'll have random exposure to multiple different sprint training stimuluses. For example, some resisted sprinting, and we may emphasize some proper sprint mechanics within that as well in trying to maintain a forward lean. We'll put some overspeed training in them as well to pull them at a higher velocity. Very unstructured and more random exposure, but it's exposure to different stimuluses in multiple planes of motions, just to ensure we're developing and setting the foundation for the athlete before we move into a more moderate or high structure. So let's look at mid-peak height velocity and specifically in the growth spurt. And we talked about it being the increased likelihood of injury, which is specific to this series, is most important for coaches and parents and athletes to be aware of with kids in this who may have suddenly been doing nothing and all of a sudden go back into a high structured sporting environment. So what we actually see here is a second spurt in sprint performance. And we see on average natural gains are about 3% improvement a year across multiple studies, and Rumpf and Moran have done work in that, looking at meta-analyses across improvements in sprint from pre, mid, and post. What we actually see though is we see diverging gender rates at sexual maturation. And that's primarily related to testosterone levels in females and estrogen or estrogen levels in females. So primarily down to the hormone response is the increase in fat mass in comparison to the increase in lean tissue in male to female. So one of the reasons for this, again, second spurt or the non-linear process of the development in speed is the ability to apply greater relative propulsive forces. So the amount of force we put into the ground, again, go to Newton's law, for every action, there's an opposite or equal reaction. So the more force we're able to put into the ground, the more we're able to get in return to push ourselves further. We've seen that in youth athletes as well, to where the improvements are more so related to stride length and not related to stride frequency. In fact, we actually see a little dip in stride frequency in the latter stages of the prepubescent young athletes developing speed. So one of the things we spoke about earlier when we looked at more so the background of this is the disproportionate growth rate of the limbs and torso, or the long bones of the legs and arms, in comparison to the spine and the torso bones. So this is termed adolescent awkwardness, and this is more pronounced in some athletes than others. But what you'll start to see is, looks like you've seen those guys where their hands are touching their knees and their hips are up into their spine. Well, that does affect coordination, does affect the functional movement skills and their ability to perform those. So it's a temporary loss maybe in coordination, but we've seen the strength training going into that may limit that, or being strong may limit that, the coordination aspect. So that usually happens on the upward curve here of the growth spurts, just as we're reaching peak height velocity. But what's a really important one specific to injury is that what we start to see after peak height velocity, somewhere between 6 to 18 months, is we see or 14 months, we see the peak weight velocity. And this is usually in relation to the increase in the onset, of sexual maturation and the hormone response. And what actually happens here is there's a lag between the increase in the bone to the increase of the muscle and tendon growth. So not only are the limbs growing disproportionately, but we're also getting disproportionate rates of growth and a time lag between the growth of the muscle and tendon and also the bone density. So this is where we see an increased likelihood of injury and fractures as well. And one of the reasons where we need to just be conscious of this, listen to the athletes, specifically if they're complaining about chronic pain. We start to see a lot of overuse injuries develop here. Some really good presentations into this prior, and we actually started to see the importance of not specializing too early in sport. So training adaptations that are non-specific to this, we've got agility, speed, strength, power, all the way down. We can see that it's a moderate structure. So some of the things we're looking to do really in the middle of this for non-specific training adaptations is increase the structure and combine modalities of training sessions. We've seen them respond better in mid to post peak height velocity with some combined training of plyometric strength and speed training. And then we want to reinforce functional movement skills and technical competencies of exercises, because we get another opportunity during this pruning of the brain to reinforce functional movement skills at this time where athletes need it because of a loss of coordination as well. Be aware of the reduced coordination and the adolescent awkwardness within young athletes at this time. Listen to them as well, and just be conscious and always allow, just like you would allow time to recover in between training sessions, you probably have to allow time to recover for natural growth. The body is continuously under stress because it's got this period of rapid growth. So even when they're not training, the body is induced under stress because of it. So what we're looking with some of our sprint specific training is we may get more phase specific, where we're not just trying to get up to top speed and have it more exploratory. We may start honing in on some specific sprint mechanics related to acceleration, related to start, related to game speed, and related to top speed. And then we'll also look at multi-directional speed of pre-planned movements in comparison to open chain movements as well. So change of direction and agility practice, ensuring that we're moving in a multi-directional nature as well to develop that holistic speed nature of the athlete. So if we look at post-peak height velocity, what we typically see as it relates to speed is natural speed gains diminish, and they're reduced in half from a natural standpoint. So what we need is to look at the training history and the competence of the athlete to determine getting more individualized in our training, where they're at from a training age, how much they've come in. We just as easy could have someone come in who's never trained with us at 15 years of age and has zero training history. That doesn't mean I'm going to go solely with individualized training. We still need to build that base. We just know that the base mightn't be, the rate of adaptation mightn't be as good as if we had pre-adolescent excitability in the central nervous system. So we probably get phase specific with our sprint interventions, and we periodize that across. So some of the stuff we have is we may have sprint specific interventions, sprint specific strength, meaning we're actually training strength in a horizontal plane of motion in addition to just a vertical plane of motion. So we just hone in and go a layer deeper, and we may individualize it to those who are force dominant or those who are velocity dominant with our athletes as well, depending on how qualitative we work with them in that phase. So we look at the training adaptation in this, and there's probably a high structure to training to where everything is set on the coach, not as much exploratory and free play with it. And they have specific sets, reps, and it's not done on time, and it's not as open in nature. Combine training modalities with longer sessions so that we have plyometric speed and strength all within the one session, taking training age and training history into account, and that we periodize these strategies specific to the sport, whether it's pre-season, whether it's in season, whether it's off season, because that will determine the amount of recovery we have in between the sessions. So this is a look at one of the evaluations we do just to show the holistic nature of everything feeding into this specific for our athletes. This is with a student athlete, so we can see we assess their anthropometric, their maturation, whether they're pre, post, or mid, so we know what guideline to go with, and then we narrow the funnel and looking at their ability to move, their exercise technique ability, and then looking at performance metrics, which are jump and sprint. So for us specific, we'd be looking at the sprint, and we'd be just ensuring that we track this over time to see basically our interventions working. So let's look at our evaluation, pretty in-depth, that we do for all our athletes as they come in. So here's just some look at some sprint-specific adaptation we have. Here's an example of some resisted sled training. So literally just straight linear sprint. We can do sled pushing, sled pulling. The main thing with this is we use this to complement our traditional strength and our unresisted sprinting, getting them up to high velocity. So here's a look at our evaluation. You can see that it's pretty holistic in nature. We focus first on the anthropometric on the top left and to assess where they are from a maturational standpoint, but only using that as a guideline to determine rate of adaptation and likelihood of injury. After that, then we look at movement ability, technical competency or exercise competency before moving into the performance metrics. Most related to today is the sprint and change of direction ability. So just assessing specific metrics over time to ensure that we have a rate of progression for the athlete, and that we can actually differentiate and distinguish between training induced gains and also natural gains that occur during adolescence. So if we look at some sprint specific adaptation, in addition to our strength training and our unresisted or unassisted training or free sprinting, what we do is, as a complementary tool, we use some resisted sprinting techniques, which may be to build what's called horizontal strength training in order to maybe improve their horizontal force capability, specifically to help the acceleration phase. So we do everything from sled pulls all the way to sled pushes. And then even changing the plane of motion and building some lateral strength as well, because we don't just move straight up and down in team sports. So we use this as a complementary tool to supplement a well-rounded training program, as you can see from the holistic nature of it, not to substitute for sprinting or not to substitute for anything else, but to complement and to supplement a well-rounded training program. We'll use multiple different iterations of backwards running, and we'll do some assisted sprinting as well, usually only assisted sprinting and overspeed with those who have very good sprint mechanics and technical competency of sprinting. It goes down to you got to be able to control force before you can focus on applying it, especially at top speed. So lastly, we've got some examples of more sprint-specific adaptations, which we'll do. So we just get more individual in nature. And here's an example of some wicket drills that we'll do in order to maybe increase the high knee aspect of it, across with our youth athletes as well. And just the key thing to show here again is the contact time. So again, there's no exercise that can get you on and off the ground like top end speed or top sprinting. So we got to ensure that we have exposure to those high velocity movements, because to get fast, you got to run fast as well. So we can start to see it get very phase specific. If we want to focus more on our top speed, we may put people to our free sprinting here and take different techniques, different avenues to improve that, right from the application of force to their ability to maintain proper sprint mechanics at those high velocities. And then we may go more acceleration focused, which will be more focused on the horizontal force, application of force, which we achieve through some heavy resisted sprinting. And then the further we get athletes as they move into our next level, we actually individualize training based upon their own individual force velocity profiles. So thanks very much for the presentation. It was a pleasure to be asked onto it. My email is here, and any social media handles. Feel free to contact me with any questions, and I'll be more than happy to oblige. Thanks very much.